Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Gracious, loving God, we thank you so much for this day and for schedules that allowed each person to be gathered here for the gift and privilege of hearing Rabbi Ed teach to us on chapters 1 and 2 of Matthew. We pray for ears to hear and eyes to see, that we'd make new connections and have new challenges and invitations for growth, and that we'd find comfort and delight in all that we hear. We also lift up those who cannot be here today in our larger world, holding them up to your care, Lord God. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Well, thanks, Val. It's always great to be with you guys. I was telling somebody that I had the privilege of teaching this class today, and she said, really? Like, what in the world would a rabbi be doing teaching the New Testament? And I said, come and you'll see. And actually, she was unable to come, but was coming next time towards the end of the semester when I'll be back. Because Matthew is a very Jewish text. And you'll see as we look at chapter 1 and 2 just how Jewish it is. So we need to spend just a few minutes and I suspect I'll be reviewing a little bit what you did last week, a little bit of context for the book before we get into chapters 1 and 2. So Matthew is written sometime between the year 80 and 100. Most people think in the mid-80s or so. It's in the context of many Judaisms that exist. In fact, some scholars say there was no such thing as Judaism, but Judaisms. And as modern Christians, you get that because you could say in some ways there's no such thing as Christianity today, right? What happens here and what happens at Grace Bible. A little different, right? And just not to pick on them, and what happens at the Catholic Church, right? There were equally varied, and maybe even more varied, Judaisms of that period. And we don't have time to get into all of them by any means, but one group of early Jews were followers of Jesus. And now we're talking about way before the Gospel of Matthew, in the first 30 years of the century during Jesus' lifetime. There were other messiahs that we know about, other purported messiahs, who other groups of Jews followed. Right? This was a very difficult time. The Romans were occupying Judea. Conditions were extremely harsh, and people were looking for a savior. And that's a little bit of the background. This isn't up until the year 30. Of course, in the year 70, Jerusalem is sacked, and everything goes totally haywire. Jesus is dead 40 years at this point, although Paul has been preaching stuff, not so much in Judea, but in Rome and in Europe. And so the first gospel that comes along is the Gospel of Mark, written shortly after 70. Some people even say 68, who knows, around that time. And the Gospel of Mark immediately is trashed by different groups who say it doesn't prove what it's supposed to prove. So mainly two groups. So the Jewish community mocks in some ways the Gospel of Mark and says, I thought you said Jesus is Messiah. Well, where's the proof? It's not here. And the Gentile community mocks it because it's not universal enough. And they're going to develop the Gospel of Luke. So Luke and Matthew kind of develop at the same time, one for the Jewish community and one for the Gentile community. So we're not going to talk about Luke, because that's a whole other story. Although it is interesting to compare.
Do you know that story?
The story of Luke?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, sometime.
But I know Matthew better. And so Matthew is kind of serving two purposes in the Jewish world. One is those people who are ethnically Jewish and were followers of Jesus and are now still part of this early nascent church are looking to defend their faith in Jesus as Messiah. And those Jews who are not part of that, who are basically saying, you guys totally missed the boat, it's addressing them. It's a sort of apologetic, in that it's telling them, you guys missed the boat. Jesus is Messiah, and here's the proof. And a good deal of the book, one of the main themes of the entire book, and especially chapters 1 and 2, is to prove that Jesus is the Messiah to the other Jews who have rejected Jesus as Messiah, but also to shore up in their own community, in Matthew's own community, which we believe consists of largely ethnic Jews, and to shore up their belief in it. And so if we were doing a more global study of the book, I could give you a list of 10 places where Mark is lacking in proving Jesus is the Messiah, and Matthew fills in those gaps. And the first one is going to be chapter 1, because where does Mark begin? With the baptism, right? With John the Baptist and the baptism. There's no birth narrative. And of course, one of the requirements of Messiah is that
Legal right,
it
birthright.
is coming from David, the Davidic line, right? And that's not there. And so Jews were going to say, how could this guy be Messiah? There's no proof he comes from the Davidic line. And guess what? Pops up the proof by Matthew. And Luke, on the other hand, and that proof we're going to see in a minute goes back to Abraham, because it's not only David, but also the Abraham connection that's important for the messianic message. Whereas Luke is going to have a very different birth narrative that's going to start with Adam, right? Because it's not so interested in the Jewish genealogy, it's interested in the universal genealogy. And by the way, if you compare those two birth narratives, just the begats, they look very different. There's a whole different line. Although, obviously you end up with Joseph and, well, actually, it's a little different, but in any event. So one thing it's going to do is want to prove that Jesus is the Messiah. And then the second thing that it's also going to deal with those Jews who don't believe that, but that's going to be much later in the book. We're not going to talk so much about that today. But it's going to do it in a way by reference to Jewish sources and traditions, much more so than any of the other Gospels. And there's a couple of, in chapters 1 and 2, there's a couple of direct quotes from Old Testament, from Hebrew Bible, but not so much that. So what were the sources? I know you all did this last week. It starts with Mark. Now chapter 1 and 2 really doesn't have any in Mark in it. It's the addition to Mark, right? It's addressing the deficiencies in Mark as those deficiencies are seen by the Jewish community. But throughout the book, it starts with Mark. There's also what's called the Q Gospel, which we don't have a copy of, but is believed to have pre-existed even Mark, and contain the materials that are common to Luke and Matthew. And Matthew and Luke would have had that, and each took those materials and then twisted them in their own way to make their points. Or I should say twisted, but explain them, right? And but the biggest source is Jewish tradition. And a lot of that was not necessarily biblical, but in the stories called Midrash that the Jewish people were familiar with. And so it wasn't only proving Jesus was Messiah, but to do it in a way that invoked the stories that Jewish people knew and were familiar with, to make it fit to say, this is the person who's been prophesied about. And here is the proof for you Jews using completely Jewish stories, but that it's not so obvious if you just read the text if you don't know the Jewish stories. So we'll look at one Jewish story today that's really an important one that comes from the historian Josephus, who wrote right about the time that Matthew is being written, but purports to tell the stories from much older. And there are other sources too. We don't have time to look at all of them. The only other thing I'll say by way of introduction is I've given you a handout. We won't have time to do go through all of it, but I'll make reference to it, and you could.
A few more.
And you can look at this at home. Many of the sources there I've taken from this book, which I'm not recommending. It's a kind of dense academic book on Matthew. It's one of my favorites as an academic, but just so you know where I've lifted many of these sources, and there's more detail in that than you'll probably want to know. And that's, it's written for academics as opposed to people who are people of faith who are looking at this as an inspiring text. So anyway, let's jump in then to chapters 1 and 2. So I think you can divide these in like basically 4 sections. There's 1 through 17 of chapter 1, which is usually called the genealogy or the birth narrative. And then the second half of chapter 1, we can call that part 2. And then you also will break chapter 2 into scenes 1 through 12, which is Herod, the Magi, and Bethlehem, and then the last part, which is the end of that story, Egypt. Right. So, but we're going to spend most of our time in chapter 1 because I think it's the more interesting chapter. So let's begin then, and remember, the context is for verses 1 through 17. It's all written as a response to the lack of messianic proof in Mark. And as I mentioned, it begins with Abraham in the genealogy, as compared with Luke, which is going to begin with Adam. And why Abraham?
Because he's the father.
He's the first Jew. He's the covenant. The covenant begins with him. Right? Adam is not a Jew. There's no such thing at that point. Right? And not only that, of course, there are promises made to Abraham. We'll get to that in a minute. That all people will gather together, yada yada, which fits the Christian message, the early Christian message. But mainly he's the first Jew. He has the first Jewish covenant with God, which is through the circumcision. And then it narrows through Jacob. And you'll notice that, in fact, in the book of Matthew as a whole, Abraham is mentioned 7 times. 7 is a magic number in biblical history. 7 days of the week, 7 years for the sabbatical year, 49 years, 7 times 7 for the Jubilee year. It's a very powerful number. And 14 is also a very powerful number because that's 2 times 7. And in the Jewish tradition at the time, people thought in 7s and 14s. This was very Jewish to list things in 7s and 14s. So the fact that Abraham's mentioned 7 times, is a reference to the Jewish context of the book. So let's start with the genealogy. And what is your verse? The very first verse. Somebody read what you got in your and how you translate it. Let's start right from the start. Go ahead.
An account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac.
Yeah, that's fine. Just verse 1. So the word genealogy is a very anglicized word. That's not really what it is. If you look at the Greek, it's the account of the origin, right? Which is much bigger than genealogy. And it parallels Genesis 2:4 and 5:1, which both are the origin of the world and the origin of the first humans, of Adam and Eve. So there's this, it's not just about a genealogy, but about how the whole thing started, right? And it's very common for many of the Hebrew books at the time to begin with an independent titular sentence like this. So the book of Job, for example, opens, this is the book of Job. And many of the books, not the first 5 books so much, but the other books open that way. So again, this is, to Jews, you're hearing a familiar Jewish literary kind of way to make this feel Jewish, right? This is how Jewish books start very often. And then the begat formula that we're going to see throughout these generations is also very common in the Hebrew Bible. It's actually one of the things that people who are bored with the Hebrew Bible will say, oh, I don't want to read all those begats. Right? In fact, the begats are some of the most interesting parts of the Hebrew Bible because they tell very deep stories. But that's what's happening here. So again, the begat formula is a literary device that Jews are familiar with. Non-Jews, not so much. This wasn't done in Greco-Roman literature. Nobody cared about the begats. But it ties it, it makes it all very Jewish. And it's really significant because this is all seen as a new beginning. And which is why the Gospel of Matthew, despite the fact that it's coming in time a good deal after Mark, is the first book of, as it's ordered in the New Testament. Because it is the book of the new beginning. All right? And you wouldn't put Genesis at the end of Deuteronomy, and you're not going to put Matthew as a time thing. And it also, follows immediately after the prophets in the Christian Bible to kind of move on from that prophetic message directly into Matthew. Right? So it's placed so remember in the Jewish Bible, the prophets are reversed with the writings. So the prophets immediately follow the 5 books of Moses, and then you have all the other books, Psalms and Proverbs and all that. But the early Christians, and when they canonized, they reversed those 2 sections so that the prophets would immediately precede Matthew and it would be a flow. Right? So a better translation of verse 1:1, rather than, what did you say?
An account of the genealogy.
The account of genealogy would be, book of the new Genesis, wrought by Jesus Christ, son of David, son of Abraham. And if we were going to be a little more on message in our translation, that's clearly what the translation is saying.
Speaking of the message, Eugene Peterson says the family tree of Jesus Christ. That's his.
Well, even beyond, I think it's not wrong, but it's beyond even the family tree, right? It's really about a new origin of everything. Our first reading, which you'll notice on the left-hand side, it says 158 to 60, and that's just the pages out of this Davies book that I copied it, is on this topic. And what we'll do is just, if someone would read just the concluding observations piece. The rest of it, read on your own. I do want to mention one thing in there, and that is Matthew's emphasis on righteousness, which comes later in the book, right? And upholding the Torah, which is, I've not come to change one tittle or dot or whatever it is. So the mention of Abraham is particularly apt, because Abraham was seen in Jewish tradition as somebody who upheld the entire Torah, even though it wasn't written yet. And there's a lot of midrash about how, for example, when the 3 men, or angels, or whatever they are, come to visit Abraham when he's ailing, he won't mix meat and milk. And they say, well, how could that be? Because the Torah's not written yet. He said, well, he knew the Torah even before it was written. So he's very much a righteous, in the Jewish tradition, about righteousness. And so the tie to Abraham is really important because of Jesus' tie to righteousness later in the gospel. The other thing I'll mention in this narrative before we read this is there's nothing in Matthew that ties directly Jesus to Isaac, but the mention of Isaac here is important because Jesus becomes a descendant of Abraham like Isaac, and who carries wood on his back and was willing to give up his life in obedience to God. And there's that hint of that there. Again, a lot of this is hints to people who know these texts like the back of their hands. So if you don't know these texts and it's not something that's a main part of who you are, you won't catch these hints, but remember who this is geared at. Right? So let's read the concluding observations about just this first line. Somebody go ahead and read.
Jesus
Christ of 1:1 is surrounded by three word pairs. Book of Genesis, son of David, and son of Abraham. These give us the three major points of the title. First, the occurrence of Genesis, whether dependent upon Genesis 2:4 and 5:1, or intended to recall the Old Testament's first book, relates the story of Jesus to the primeval history. This means, according to the principle that the end will be like the beginning, that the gospel concerns eschatology. It recounts the fulfillment of the hope for a new creation. Then secondly, the phrase of son of David represents Jesus as the king of Israel, the rightful heir to the Davidic promises. This too pertains to eschatology. The Messiah has come. Lastly, son of Abraham probably implies not only that Jesus is a true Israelite, but also, for reasons given above, that with his appearance God's promise to the patriarch has been realized. All the nations of the earth have been blessed.
And so this is just the concluding what he has about verse 1:1. And if you just read verse 1:1, it looks like, all right, this is genealogy, that's nice. Right? But it's very deep. Right? It's saying and to the trained listener who knows these stories, that's what they're hearing. Right? And that's what it's invoking. Think about, you can see a 20-second ad of somebody wearing jeans, and then it evokes all sorts of, she's gorgeous, she's slim, she's whatever, and advertisers know how to sell a message, and so did Matthew, right? He knows his audience, and what he's trying to convince both his followers, but also the Jews who are not his followers, because that's the conflict that's existing right then. All right, so let's move on to the actual genealogy itself. So in verse 17, Val, would you read verse 17?
Sure. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations, and from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations, and from the deportation of Babylon to the Messiah, 14 generations.
So we have 14 repeated 3 times, right? Now he could have said there are 14 generations in each of these without repeating the number of 14 each time, because they know what a holy number. 14 is twice the holy number, right? It's like, oh yeah, 7's holy? Well, we'll double that. And repeating it 3 times is very powerful. Anybody who's ever taken a course in public speaking knows that the way you get your message across is three times. And if you look at the breakdown, you get 2 by 7, or 14 generations to David, right, from Abraham to David. 14 more to Jeconiah, which is the exile to Babylon. So Abraham to David is one group, then David till the Jews are exiled in 586 to Babylon. That's another era. And it was also that's the era that the prophets are writing, because it's the last time they experienced total disruption. And post-exile, there's actually, if you count them, you'll see there's 13. Not 14, but they say there's 14 because that makes a better number. And there's a lot of speculation as how can they say 14 when if anybody who can count can see there's 13. Well, some say you count Babylon as one. Some say you count Mary separately in addition to the 13 that I mentioned. Some say you count David twice because he's so cool. Some say Matthew made a math error. Someone says there was another one that was redacted out by some later redactor and we don't have the original. But what you should know is that playing with numbers is not uncommon to biblical texts. They do it all the time. It's not like lying. These texts were not science texts, right? They're not mathematical texts. And the Jews loved to play with numbers. And I could show you 100 examples in the Talmud, which is being written at the same time. There were 10 of these, but then they list them, there's only 9. I mean, this was kind of what they did. And it was okay. That was another literary convention.
They round it up or round it down.
Well, or actually, playing with the numbers often had a lot more significance than than just like, they knew what they were doing, right? They didn't just make an error, like that. So if you were to review, we're not going to do this, but if you were to review the Old Testament, right, you would see that there's all sorts of generations that are missing here, right? Like the 3 kings between Joram and Uzziah, if you're interested in going back and looking, you'll see they're all gone. Why? Well, that would make it 70. And there's also many discrepancies with Luke's genealogy. So the point is that it was important to present it as 14. Now, if you're a skeptic, you'd say, oh, that's alternative facts. But not necessarily so. And so if somebody would want to read on page 1 of our handout, that last paragraph. Go ahead.
Partly out of a fondness for symmetry, and partly because 14 was the value of David's name.
We'll come back to that. I'll explain that in a minute.
And in the conviction that salvation history could be neatly divided into epics of equal count, the evangelist imposed the number 14 upon the list behind 1, 6.
Yeah, that's the verses.
Okay. In order, however, to accomplish this imposition, he had to omit 4 names from the monarchical period.
You could skip them, the names.
And add at least 2 to the post-monarchical period. If to be objected that Matthew could not have made so much of the 3 by 14 pattern if it were simply the result of his own editing, it suffices to observe that the rabbis tended to reduce things and numbers to the very same when they were near alike. There is an example of this.
And a particular rabbinic text, well, never mind that, go ahead.
Here reference is made to the 10 sayings by which the world was made, the 10 generations.
Let's go ahead and skip that and go down to the last sentence, just in the interest of time. It's interesting, but we don't have time. The manipulation of numbers.
The manipulation of numbers for edifying ends was an established practice, and we can readily believe that Matthew could have been fully aware of the artificiality of his patterns and still, at the same time, have thought it significant and worthy of attention.
Yeah, so why 14? There's a lot of possibilities. There's the number 7 thing we've talked about. The moon cycle. It's 14 days of waxing and then 14 days of waning. And everyone knew this because the moon provided the calendar. And so you wax to David, 14, and then wane to the point of captivity, 14 more to Jesus at the high point. So this was another kind of literary tool.
And we've waned until, never mind.
So you get 3 times 14 also equals 6 times 7. So Jesus stands at the head of the 7th, the dawn of eternal Sabbath would be another motif. The apocalyptic texts, which by and large don't make their way into the Hebrew Bible, like Enoch and Baruch and these kind of texts that kind of get written out, also break up time like this regularly. This is a writing style of the time. By the way, Matthew, apart from the number 7, Matthew loves the number 3, right? Gifts for Jesus, 3 magi. You can list a whole bunch of 3s in there. And the one I wanted to explain is it says David's name. So in Hebrew, the way you count is you use the alphabet. So the first letter, Aleph, has a value of 1, and Bet has a value of 2, and Gimel has a value of 3, and so on. And this is a counting system called gematria, and even today in modern Hebrew you use that. And there was the understanding that the value of something, of a name, or of anything, was a hint at its essence. Well, guess what the value of David is?
14.
14. And you could call it a form of poetry. And some people have kind of made it into some nonsense, like finding stuff in there that's not there. But today we use in our poetry rhyme and meter and all sorts of poetic techniques. One of the biblical poetic techniques was called gematria. And it was if a word had a value of X and there was another word with a value of X, there's a link. And this was done all the time, and I could show you example after example. David has a value of 14, this is important. And Jews would have, more important, Jews would have known that that's important. Kind of get a little confused.
Well, the Vav is 6?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, Dalet is 4, Vav is 6, and Dalet is 4, so
Got it.
14. So, so the other thing I want to mention about the genealogy, that this, we could spend a whole year on the genealogy, it's that interesting. But there's a couple of, just one or two other themes, because we need to move on. And that's the presence of the women in the genealogy. Every one of the women mentioned is sexually or otherwise sketchy, right? So Tamar is the Canaanite woman who was impregnated by her father-in-law Judah. Rahab was a prostitute. Ruth was a convert. Uriah's wife is Bathsheba, who was an adulteress. But yet there's no mention of Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah, the matriarchs, the righteous women. So why only the sketchy women? Also missing from the genealogy, of course, are brothers like Esau, Judah's 11 brothers, because this is the line of David, and it's only the line of David that they're concerned about. And there are these sketchy women in the line of David. So let me throw that question out. Why do you think that Matthew would include these sketchy/sinning women in the genealogy? Connie?
Well, I had a couple of thoughts. One is that we can't really ever say that there was an evolution of the perfect man by the fact that his family line just kept getting better and better. He had all these skeletons. That was one. But I love the idea that Ruth, as a Moabitess, she's not even a Jew. I mean, she's not...
Well, she converts, but
She
yeah.
converts, but it's lovely to think that it didn't matter in his genealogy that there be this bloodline that was pure, I guess.
So that's a very charitable reading.
Okay.
I mean, there's any number of reasons that Jews might have heard these sketchy women as actually a positive thing.
Would it be, I'm not going to let you criticize me, I'm going to put it out there first.
So
that
that's
I'm
one of
owning
them.
it.
That's actually right. That
I
one
have
of
a
the
son who used to do that.
one of the critiques.
Tell on himself.
One of the Jewish critiques, as I said earlier, this is they're responding to the much larger Jewish community who thinks that this is a joke, that Jesus is Messiah, because for Jews, the Messiah doesn't die and come back, or die at all. I mean, the Messiah ushers in the perfect world. That's the test of Messiah. If you don't usher in the perfect world, you're not Messiah. So they think this is like a total joke. And Matthew's out to prove it's no joke, it's real. And for those Jews who are saying this is ridiculous, and the idea of the virgin birth, or of Mary, who gets pregnant by some entity other than Joseph, Matthew is saying, hey, there's all sorts of sketchy women in the Messianic line before David. This is and responding to those people who are saying, who are criticizing specifically the Mary part of the story, that this is how the Messianic line works. If you want to be a little more charitable, you'd say it demonstrates God's grace and forgiveness, because all these women become very righteous. They start off sketchy. They're sexually sketchy, but they, as you said with Ruth, she becomes very righteous. And of course, one could say men were sinners too, but that seems not to be pointed out.
Larry, that's exactly what I was thinking, is that you were just talking about sketchy women. Well, I don't know all the stories of all these men, but they were being sketchy
Right.
sexually.
Right, but
And maybe patriarchy cares about women's
Sketch,
sexuality,
yeah.
but maybe God doesn't.
So that's
In
a
that
that's a
sense.
great if you were in my class, I'd assign you to write a paper on that.
With pleasure.
But another theory is, as Connie hinted to a minute ago, is that women are about salvation of Gentiles. But the best case, I think, if you look at all these, I mean, it could be all these reasons, it doesn't have to be one, right?
But I never thought about Mary needing to be supported by these other women.
Oh, that's the best case, that's the
That's-
obvious
that's
reason,
huge.
is it's probably a setup for Mary's credibility,
Yes.
right? Because she fits right in line. It's not only is her sexual sketchiness no longer a liability, it becomes an asset, right? Because that's how the Messiah is going to come, through sexual. On the women's side, it's going to be sexual sketchiness. And one of the Talmud stories that's being written about the same time that we don't hear much about is, there's not much in the Talmud about Jesus. In a huge, I think it's 65 volumes, there's 5 or 6 references to Jesus, and none of them are complimentary. But the one about his birth is that Mary had an affair with a Roman soldier, and they even name him, and then tried to cover it up with this Messiah story. Now, we don't, it's very, all this stuff is hard to know, because in the Middle Ages, the Jews and Jewish texts were attacked, and many of these were burned, and Jews were forced to redact from their text anything that was considered derogatory about Christians. So we no longer have the originals, but what we do have that little, his name was Pantera, and Jesus was in the Jewish community called Ben Patera, the son of Patera, the Roman centurion who supposedly Mary had an affair with. But the point is, that would be that would have been the story that was circulating among the Jews, and that needed to be responded to. And the response was, you may think she's sketchy, maybe it's Pantera, maybe it's not, who knows, she's sketchy. I mean, we don't know too many women who get pregnant in this way. And I suspect if your daughter told you she came home pregnant and said, and you said, who's the father? And she said, the Holy Spirit, you might be a little bit suspicious. And so that had to be addressed. Another story, by the way, is that this soldier, Pandera, had actually raped Mary, which would have been very common, because the Roman soldiers commonly raped Jewish women, and could. It wasn't illegal. There's a good summary of, we're going to leave that genealogy, and on page 2 of your handout, there's a summary of those first 17 verses. So, you see it, that's the whole page 2 of your handout. So why don't we go around, start with you, Connie. Each one will read and read quickly, because we're not going to, and skip over the citations, because we're not here to do scholarly papers. So go ahead.
Section 1. This section offers proof of the title, Jesus is the son of Abraham and the son of David, more particularly because the heritage of the king is from the son to son only, and because Jesus is, through his father, a descendant of King David. In this respect, he qualifies as the Davidic Messiah.
Okay, good. Ramona?
Jesus came at the right time, although the apocalypses of Judaism contain several different outlines of history.
This is
Dan,
significant.
They all place the epic of the exile immediately before the epic of redemption. Yeah.
This is significant because the history has been divided into periods and places. The appearance of Jesus at the end of the exilic period. So the time of the Messiah's birth admirably falls in line with a presumably common eschatological calendar.
Good. Third one, Roxanne. One through 17, yeah.
Outlines a story whose surety is God and whose culmination is Jesus Christ. God gave promises to Abraham. He also gave promises to David. Throughout Israel's history, these promises often seem to be in jeopardy, as at the Babylonian captivity, but God remained faithful despite appearances, and his faithfulness became fully and finally manifested in the birth of Jesus, the flower of Judaism and the telos of salvation history, in whom the promises to Abraham and David find their yes.
Okay, and in the interest of time, these last two is, the before is about the irregular and potentially scandalous unions, Even unions with Gentiles were blessed by God in this history. And number 5, congregations which included both Jews and Gentiles could not find their identity in the shared racial heritage, but they found it instead in their common Lord and Savior who was with them when they gathered together. And you can read this in more detail on your own. We don't have the time. So I want to move on to the second half of chapter 1, verses 18 through 25. And you should know that all of this is original to Matthew, this part. It doesn't it's or what's called redactional. In other words, he's not taking it from Mark, he's not taking it from Q, he's making it up. I'm not saying he's making it up of whole cloth. There may be oral history or whatever, but this is the first time we see anywhere this written down. And you're going to see in just a minute that this is really the crux, even more so, of how he appeals to Jews, right? So this is the first time that any text denies Joseph's participation in fathering Jesus. But Matthew has in mind legal, not physical descent, right? Which is why that's the Joseph. The physical descent is the Joseph part, and so it goes on to the first dream of Joseph, and which quotes Isaiah 7:14. And what's that dream? Joseph's first dream.
The angel appears and tells her not to be afraid to take Mary because what she has is from God.
Yeah. By the way, who else has 3 dreams? There's going to be 3 dreams to Joseph. Who else has 3 dreams? Joseph.
And
Yeah.
somebody else said Joseph.
Yeah. No. Okay. So that's 3. You're going to see that the 3 dreams to Joseph directly parallel the 3 dreams to the other Joseph. But more important, the key to understanding all of chapters 1 and 2 is understanding the Moses tradition. And so the next text, which I brought for you, is on page 3, and actually there's 2 texts. The first one is Josephus, who's a historian, writing. He lived from 30 till 70, till 100, the year 100, and so this is probably written roughly the same time, maybe a little before the Gospel of Matthew. And the second one is a text called Pseudo-Philo, which is Philo was a writer from the first part of the 1st century, and Pseudo-Philo was somebody who wrote pretending to be Philo, but it was a common. And these are both, so the historian isn't exactly Midrash, he's writing what he sees as Jewish history, but it really is Midrash. And it's a retelling of the Moses story as the Jews understood it. And although I'm giving you a sort of synopsis version, because the versions he was relying on are much longer and more complicated. So this is kind of the summary version, and otherwise we wouldn't have time to read the whole versions that he's familiar with, which are much older. So it's worth reading this entire piece. So why don't we start with you, Val, and we'll go around, and everyone can read 1 paragraph. And we're just going to read the first one, the Josephus piece, because the second one adds a little to it, but you'll get the idea from the first piece, and we don't have time to do the second. So Val, will you start?
While they were in these circumstances, the following additional cause spurred on the Egyptians the more to eradicate our race. A certain one of the sacred scribes, for they are skilled in their ability to predict the future accurately, announced to the king that someone would be begotten at the time to the Israelites who would humble the rule of the Egyptians and would elevate the Israelites. And having been reared, he would surpass all men in surpass all men in virtue and acquire a reputation held in everlasting memory.
Who's this?
Moses.
Right, yeah. Go on, Molly.
I'm not sure,
Alarmed.
Alarmed, Alarmed, the king, in accordance with the opinion of that man, ordered that every male fathered by the Israelites should be cast into the river and destroyed, and that the midwives of the Egyptians should watch carefully the pangs of childbirth of the Hebrew women and should observe closely their deliveries.
Okay.
For he ordered that they should be delivered of children by these who, because of kinship, were not likely to transgress the wish of the king. Those, however, who disregarded the decree and dared secretly to save the child that had been born to them, he ordered to be put to death together with their offspring.
Melissa?
Terrible, therefore, was the suffering of those who underwent it, insofar as they were deprived of their children, and those who themselves were parents performed the destruction of the children, but also the plan of the extinction of their race, through the destruction of their children and their own future annihilation, made their misfortune bitter and inconsolable.
They were in this misery. No one, however, can overcome the will of God, not even if he contrives countless devices for it. For the child whom the sacred scribe foretold was nurtured, having escaped the surveillance of the king, and the one who had made the prediction was found true in the things that would happen through him, and it happened thus.
And Merari's, one of those.
Yeah, so that's a Greek, so Moses' father, his name is Amram in the Jewish text, and this was written in Greek, and in Greek he's called Amarames.
One of those well-born among the Hebrews was in a quandary since he feared on behalf of the whole race, lest it become extinct through lack of a young generation that would grow up afterwards. And he was troubled on his own account, for his poor wife was pregnant.
So he turned to supplication of God, imploring him to take pity at length on men who had transgressed not at all in worship of him, and to grant release to them from the misfortunes from which they were suffering at that time, and from the expectation of the demise of their race.
God, having pity on him and impressed with his supplication, appeared to him in his sleep and urged him not to despair about the future, and said that he held their piety in his memory and would always bestow a reward for it, having already granted to their ancestors to become such a multitude from a few.
He recalled that Abramos,
That's Abraham, that's the Greek name for Abraham.
who had set out alone from Mesopotamia to Chananiah, was blessed both in other respects and in the fact that his wife, who had formerly been barren, afterwards, in accordance with his will, had become fertile, and that he had fathered sons and bequeathed to Ismailos and his descendants.
That's Isaac.
Yeah, the land of the Arabians, and Troglodytis to his descendants from Keturah, and Chananiah to Isakos. Yeah. As many deeds of bravery as he performed in war with my age, he said, you would seem to be impious if you did not hold in memory. And it happened that Ichabod also was well known even to those who were not of his nation for both the greatness of the prosperity with which he lived and that which he bequeathed to his children.
Jacob, right, yes.
What was that?
Jacob.
Though he arrived in Egypt with 70 in all, you have already become, I believe, more than 600,000.
Now know that I am looking after your common welfare and your fame, for this child, because of whose birth the Egyptians, in their fear, have condemned those born from the Israelites to perish, will be yours, and you shall escape notice of those who are on guard against destruction.
And nurtured in a surprising way, he shall deliver the race of the Hebrews from their distress among the Egyptians, and he shall be remembered as long as the universe shall endure, not only among Hebrew men, but also among foreigners. Since I bestow this favor upon you and those who will be descended from you, and he shall have such a brother as to hold my priesthood, both he and his descendants for all time. Once the vision had revealed these things to him, Abraham was awakened and revealed them.
No, Amram, not Abraham, this is Moses' father.
Oh, okay. Revealed them to,
Jochebed, that's Moses' sister.
okay, his wife, and their fear became so greater because of the prediction in the dream, for they were
Oh, that's his wife, sorry, yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
For they were apprehensive not only with regard to the child, but also for the greatness of his future happiness.
Okay, we don't have time for the second text, which repeats some of that and adds a few more details, but it should be obvious to you what's going on here, what Matthew is doing, right?
Wow, using Moses.
It is a retelling of that story, right? When we subtract the Moses story from Matthew, there's only 3 contributions by Matthew that are original. One is the virginal conception by the Holy Spirit, one is the birth in Bethlehem, and the other is the Magi following a star. All 3 of those, incidentally, are linked to the Davidic tradition. We don't have time to explain why, but so these verses have 3 parts. It's the Mosaic story, the David Christology, which comes in from these other 3 things, and the redactionist Old Testament site that we find in our text. So we want to look at a couple of things a little more closely. No, we don't really have time, except to say that we could compare these dreams exactly correspond in nature to Joseph's dreams. Obviously, Herod is Pharaoh. The killing of the boys is the same. The virgin birth, actually, which later Christians would say comes from Isaiah, who said, where the prophet says there will be a virgin. It's actually, that's a misquote of Isaiah. It doesn't. The word for virgin is betula, and that's not what Isaiah said. It's alma, a young woman, and so that does not fit with what Jews would have known. And so some say that what really is the virgin birth is more really a reference to Sarah, who couldn't get pregnant, and at 90 years old, she suddenly gets pregnant. That somehow God is involved in this birth process is a stronger call than the Isaiah text, which really no Jew would have thought said virgin, right? Now later Christian apologists are going to say, well, an Alma, a young woman, would have been a virgin. Well, I don't know how many girls in high school you know who are young women. They're not necessarily virgins. I mean, that's sort of the comeback, right? But it doesn't, it wouldn't have really fit. And so the idea that this is really Isaiah's prophecy would not have made sense to Jews, because that's not what Isaiah says.
So Ed,
Yeah.
how about this? We're into our break time, so how about you take 5 more minutes and we'll have a little bit of a shorter break.
So we're not going to get to chapter 2 is what, yeah.
Maybe.
Oh, let him go on.
Yes,
Okay,
please.
let's take a vote. Are we willing to make a little change here? If you need
Yes.
to use the restroom, go use the restroom. Okay,
Okay.
go ahead.
All right. And chapter 2 we can do in 10 minutes. So. And there's so much in chapter 1 we didn't cover, but
It's all good, all good.
Take your time.
I knew this would happen. It always does.
Sorry, I hit your foot. Keep going.
Oh, I thought you said we're going to take a break.
No, we'll take the break later.
Oh, okay,
So,
okay.
if everybody's okay with that, and they'll just take their own break if needed.
Okay. So, let's see, where were we in our readings? We're going to skip. So let's look at page 5 of the handout, and in the middle of the page there, it was where I left off. So what led believers in the virginal conception of Jesus to see the Holy Spirit as the agent of that conception? According to Raymond Brown, who's one of the probably most prominent Matthew scholars, it was the outcome of a Christological process by which the moment of Jesus' divine sonship, first tied to the resurrection, was moved back to the ministry and baptism and then to the conception. Because divine adoption at the resurrection and at the baptism was considered the work of the Spirit. So the Spirit's activity was again naturally invoked when Christians came to believe that Jesus was God's Son at his conception. So the whole scene at the end, where Jesus is crucified and God adopts him as Son, gets read back to it's got to be the Holy Spirit as the Father also, and that's where that likely comes from. let's see, so the next text on page 5 and 6 is something you can read on your own. But I do want to get to the Matthew original material. So we could speak all day about that Moses story and how it connects to the Jesus story. The parallels are overwhelming. There's no question, but it's simply a retelling of that story, which, by the way, is how Jewish midrash work. You know, all this that's you retell the story, and then you add your elements to make your point. That's how storytelling works. And so, but when the story is familiar to your audience, then it makes sense because we know this story. Now it's just being retold in a new way. So Matthew adds in chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, which is he adds the Herod, the Magi, and Bethlehem. So the Magi are representatives of the best wisdom of the Gentile world, right? Well, by the way, Abraham supposedly mastered what's it called, the stars and astrology and stuff. So there's a hint when you talk about the Magi that you get these Abraham colors. But the Magi make some important points. First, while Jewish leaders are rejecting Jesus as Messiah, the Gentiles from the East are anxious to greet him. So this is a little bit of polemic. Like, you guys, the enlightened ones, can't see this, but these kind of barbarians from the East can. Note, by the way, in Matthew, that they are not kings. They are not three, which is much later Christian tradition. We three kings are... I don't know where that comes from. I guess Luke, I think, but it's not here. But it's Midrash, right? The writing style of Midrash was early Christians used it too. But they come right out of another Hebrew story. A Hebrew Bible story. Which story?
The three visitors?
No, there's not three.
The three Hebrew children?
No. A story that everybody would know, and you know too. Balak and Balaam. What happens? So in the book of Numbers, chapter 22, the Jews are going through the land of King Balak, and King Balak says they're too numerous for me to deal with, and he hires this prophet who's from the east, who's a sorcerer of sorts.
Curse them.
To curse them. Balaam, his name is, Bilam or Balaam, to destroy the Jewish people, but they he ends up only able to bless them. So these people from the east come ultimately to bless, and only bring honor to Israel in that story, or to Jesus in this one.
So it wasn't the number three, it was the fact that it was someone from the east.
Yeah, the number 3 is not even there. Look at your
Okay,
text.
So where we got confused.
Oh.
We were looking for 3 when you were looking for east.
Okay. And so Balaam prophesies in 24:17 of Numbers, a star will come forth out of Jacob and a scepter will rise out of Israel. That's what, but interestingly enough, the Septuagint is the first, the Greek translation, which Christians will use, translates scepter as a man, and a man will come out of Israel. So whatever, it's an arguable Hebrew question. It's always in the Hebrew Bible, though it's always, or the translations that we have, it's always scepter, but some scholars say you can translate it as man also. Jews, by the way, thought that person was Bar Kokhba, who led the revolution against the Romans in the 2nd century and failed. And he was, most Jews actually, an overwhelming number of Jews thought he was the Messiah. But when he was killed, that belief ended. And in fact was criticized by the rabbis later for even having the rabbis are very down on this idea of Messiah being actually here. All right. So there's a famous story in the Talmud that says someone says, if you're planting a tree and someone says, hey, the Messiah's coming, he's just over the hill, say, finish planting your tree and then go see if it's real. It's kind of like, we believe that redemption will come, but we're not going to put our faith in. We've been burned too many times by this. Here he is. So right. So verses 3 through 5 in chapter 2. Notice how we're starting to get the beginnings of some.
Chapter 2.
Chapter 2 of the text.
I know, but I thought.
Oh, no, I'm not
referred
looking at
to
the
this.
handout,
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
Verses 3 and 5, chapter 2, notice how we're starting to get the first bit of anti-Jewish polemic. So it associates all of Jerusalem and Jewish leadership with Herod, who of course is only a half-Jew. And of course Jerusalem can't represent all Jews since Joseph and Mary are Jews. And this, in Josephus' passage, the scribes play the same role. By the way, notice how the scribes are the ones who tip off Pharaoh, and the scribes are the ones who tip off Herod. Bethlehem, in verse 6, the quote to Bethlehem comes from Micah 5:2. And it's more of a midrash than a quote, because Micah doesn't say the land of Judah, which is added in Matthew, right? Which is added to connect David. So they'll take a quote and they'll change the quote or add to it in order to suit his purposes. And I'm not.
Maybe he put parentheses around it.
Maybe, yeah. Or an asterisk, or the footnote's gone, right? And there are many other small wording changes to fit the purpose. It's important, though, that Micah 5:3-6, which are not quoted, the very next verses that he leaves out, right, shows that this Messiah will be a military leader who will fight the Assyrians. And there's no evidence in Jewish tradition that Bethlehem was Messiah's birthplace. So he's wanting to. So he takes this quote, but he takes one line, and like all good people who use quotes do, he leaves out the second half, because that doesn't serve his purpose. And he adds a bit that wasn't there, and presto, you've got what you got. Also note, by the way, that Mary and Joseph are living in Bethlehem at the time, but in Luke, they're visiting Bethlehem. And so just a challenge to figure out what that's all about. So Herod needs to know precisely when Jesus was born, so he could know what age children to order killed. And you'll notice he chooses to kill all boys up to age 2, because he doesn't know precisely when Jesus was born. And this is showing a sort of real viciousness, because it's far broader than he needs to be, which ties him into Pharaoh better, right? Because Pharaoh was overly broad, overly vicious. I mean, Pharaoh was the devil incarnated, and so is Herod, right? The gifts are common in the Hebrew Bible, and there's a reading on page 6 of your text that you can look at and talks about those references. And there's all just before that on page 6 is about the Joseph connections, the Joseph of the Jesus story with the Joseph of the Bible story. And I mentioned to note in verse 13 we get another dream of Joseph, the father of Jesus. And notice that Joseph, I said, in the Old Testament has 3 dreams. The first one is that all will worship him. The second one is hard times are coming. And the third has him lifting him up in order to save the people by being the viceroy. And that's the 3 motifs of Joseph, father of Jesus' dreams. And we also have the counterpart of Moses running from Egypt, where he'll encounter God and return. And Abraham and Jacob also flee to Egypt. And of course, where does Jesus flee? Egypt, until it's safe for him to return. And Moses stays until it's safe for him to return. Abraham and Isaac both flee to Egypt and it's saved from where they return. So there's many ways you can take all this, and different teachers will take you in different ways depending on, and many of the Christian clergy who'll teach you will have a different emphasis, right? But since I'm a rabbi, my emphasis is on the Jewish connections of the text, because that's what people would have, the lens through which people would have heard it in the first place. And again, with these stories, it's kind of a mashup of the Old Testament, right? With especially Moses and especially Joseph, Abraham and Isaac built in there, David obviously built in, all of which makes the point that this guy is Jewish as the day is long and follows and is the Messiah. Notice that it happens at night in verse 14. The whole Herod thing, it could just be danger, but the Exodus happens at night as well. And that's a big point in the Hebrew Bible. The Herod and Pharaoh comparisons are obvious. We know from history that Herod conducted many massacres. And so, as did Pharaoh. So that's actually a historical fact. Verse 18, we get this quote from Jeremiah. And there's something very interesting about this, and that is that Matthew's use of this quote is, the translation is much closer to Jeremiah than it is to the Septuagint. In other words, the Septuagint is written in the 3rd century BC. It's translating the Bible into Greek. Matthew would either be using the original or would be using the Septuagint, or maybe both. But he's much closer to the original, which tells us that Matthew knew Hebrew and wasn't relying on Greek. Luke didn't know Hebrew. Right? Luke was a Greek speaker.
Rabbi Ed?
Yes.
The reference to Sheba and the riches this is the first time I've seen it as riches from Sheba.
Read me the whole verse. I'm not sure. Where are you?
What's that?
Where are you reading from?
I'm on page 6.
Oh, the handout.
Of the handout.
Okay, yeah.
And there are a couple of references there. I've never made that connection before. Down at the bottom of
the top reading or
next
the
to
second
the
reading?
last paragraph.
Oh, the Solomon thing.
Yes.
Yeah. So there's another one. All of this I'm offering you to read on your own because we just don't have the time there. But yeah, right. We're just touching the surface here. We have, and I'm already over time, and I'm going to take one more minute to finish up.
Take your time.
But the depth at which
Is that a common illusion or not?
Well, I don't. It's an allusion that would have spoken to the Jewish people at the time, right? It's a mashup.
Yeah.
It is all of these stories mashed up. These are your stories, folks, right? These are your stories. I'm just updating them and showing you how it flows into this new story, right? That and this is so much what the genealogy does. If you go beyond begat, is it all flows into a big story like Genesis itself, which is the unfolding of all of creation. This is the unfolding of Jesus as the Messiah.
At Jesus' death, they thought he was from Nazareth. How could he be the Messiah? Because they thought he was a Nazarene. This just clears up all of that for the people.
For the Jewish people,
Yeah.
right? For the Gentiles, you've got Luke, and that's a whole different story, right? And then if you go in with Mark, it doesn't have any of this stuff at all, which is, even the last part of Mark, of course, is added much later. So the verse 19, we get the third dream, which is like Joseph's third dream. And I guess we'll conclude with the reading from on page. So I'm going to ask, on your own you could read the sort of summary of chapter 2, which is page 7 of your handout. And this is a nice summary of what we've been talking about. The only one I'm going to read is is the last paragraph, paragraph 8, on the middle of the right-hand column, which sort of adds something a little new that we haven't talked about. Leonardo da Vinci's Adoration of the Magi highlights an aspect of Matthew's text that other artists and some exegetes have missed. Matthew 2, 1 through 12 has not only a foreground, but also a background. In Da Vinci's painting, behind the Magi and Jesus and Mary, there are buildings in ruin and horsemen at joust. The meaning is manifest. The world into which the Messiah comes is in chaos and decay. Things need to be righted. This is also an element in Matthew's story. When Jesus is born, Jerusalem, instead of being overjoyed, is troubled at the news. And there is upon Israel's throne a wicked and illegitimate ruler. And innocent blood is about to be shed. In brief, the world is ill. Is it any wonder that the first word out of Jesus' public proclamation is repent? And so that's a little, all the first 7 paragraphs of this will, actually you should look at T.S. Eliot's poem, Journey of the Magi, also just before that on your own. And by the way, when this whole idea that Jesus saves one from sin in Matthew is sin in the ancient world was thought to be the cause of disease. And when it says Jesus saves you from sin, it wasn't about his death. It was about that Jesus heals. Right? That Jesus overcomes the sin that has caused your illness. And that's how Jews would have thought about it at that time, because this idea of saving you from death didn't make any sense to Jews. And then so finally, we'll look at the last page of the handout. And I know I've been jumping around here because there's a lot of material, and I'm trying to just, as we go along, identify some of the more important pieces. And this is a little, so Davies and Allison, the book I've been referring to, do this little comparison between Matthew and Exodus. So Matthew has, but when Herod died, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt. Exodus. And these many days the king of Egypt died. The Lord said to Moses in Midian, go back to Egypt, for all those seeking your life have died. And back to Matthew, saying, rising, taking the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those seeking the life of the child have died. And then Matthew, rising, he took the child and his mother and went unto the land of Israel. Moses, taking his wife and his children, mounted them on asses and returned to Egypt. So they got them going in the opposite direction. And of course, later on, we're going to see this scene, what's it called, the Transfiguration. That's very controversial, because you get Jesus on the mountain with Moses and Elijah, and Jesus.
Law prophets.
What?
Law prophets.
Yeah, except that what happens is they all get wiped out and Jesus replaces them. And that becomes the beginning of what's called Christian replacement theology, which leads to anti-Semitism. Instead of saying there are which could have said there's this history of prophets and Jesus is the next in line, the fact that the others sort of get wiped out and he's the only one standing is meant to say that Judaism is no longer valid. But that's written in the context of a battle, an ideological battle for who has the truth. And so you have to understand that times were very, in the end of the first century, times, the challenges that, the overwhelming number of people were Jews and were not accepting Jesus as Messiah. Matthew's community was a relatively small one. There may have been some other early ethnic Jews who did accept Jesus as Messiah, but they were fighting for legitimacy in a world that largely rejected their view. And so naturally they're attacking their opponents. They weren't permitted to preach in the synagogues because at this point they're considered, early on they're sort of like a sect of Judaism. It's sort of like the Methodists inviting the Presbyterians or whatever to come preach in their synagogue. But as they drift further away in ideology, the the Methodists are saying, okay, Presbyterians, you're not invited here anymore, you got this very different understanding than we do. And then the Presbyterians react and say, oh yeah, well, you got it all wrong, and then the next thing you know, you have a war. And that's what happened there, except I used a bad example because those two are like almost the same. But, but you know, you see what I'm saying. That's kind of the context for all of this. And when I'm back with you in February for chapter 23, that which is the horribly anti-Jewish stuff that I chose when Val sent me the list. It's important to know that context because that's the second, as I said, the first mission of Matthew is to prove that Jesus is Messiah in the light of Mark, which is heavily criticized by Jews as saying, you didn't make any case to me. And the second mission is to show that the Jews got it wrong. And because of the socio-historical context that we only touched on today. So you go home and you can read all these others, and it'll take you a little deeper into some of the things we skimmed over. And glad to be with you. Sorry I took so long.
No,